Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for joining me today, and thanks for the guys here online. So today we're going to be talking about rehabilitation, specifically the PRCP process. Share my screen. So today's agenda, we're going to be looking at an overall understanding of the PRCP here in Queensland. So for those who are not familiar with it, it's just a quick update on the legislation and the policies that resulted from the resulted in the PRCP changes here in Queensland, the drivers for that, the policy elements, which is specific to PRCP and what is statutory requirement, the PRCP assessment process, so when lodging a PRCP, rehabilitation planning, which is one of the sections that is required for PRCPs, the schedule, which is the statutory element, and then lessons learned by industry so far. So having a look currently what's happened in the Australian legislation and reform of legislation in the last couple of years. There are two massive areas which needed to have a bit of a focus on based on the fact that there was a lot of money being piled up in rehabilitation and the costs that were being incurred by the government, or the potential costs, weren't being calculated correctly. So there were two areas, which is the driven from the Mineral and Energy Resources Act of 2018. And there were two documents. That was the review of the Queensland's Financial Assurance Framework, and then there was the Better Mind Rehabilitation for Queensland. So the Act amended the original Environmental Protection Act of 1994, rather, and that introduced some new requirements, one particularly around that progressive rehabilitation and closure plannings, which is the PRCP we're talking about today, but also about the new financial provisioning scheme and how rehabilitation is actually costed and calculated from that environmental authority. In terms of how we can actually see where this information has come from, you can see that you've got your two main policy papers, which resulted in the change in the Act in 2018, the two new financial provisioning schemes, and the new requirements for progressive rehabilitation, resulting in PRCPs. PRCPs have two elements, one which is your planning part and the other which is your schedule part, which is statutory. So PRCPs are a multidisciplinary field, and originally a lot of the environmental authority or impact statements wasn't done by your environmental teams on site or in head offices. This process now actually requires more people to be involved than rather than just the environmental team. So that traditional focus now includes mine planning, engineering, geology, geotech, and also consultation with communities. So I guess one of the big things is that we've now replaced the rehabilitation requirements in the EA through providing your PRCP by how mining activities will progressively rehabilitated from the start of mining all through till the end of mine life, and also focuses on that post-closure planning as well. So this timeline gives you a bit of an understanding. So in 2018, you can see that the bill was passed, and then in 2019, 1st of November, it commenced a transition period. So for any work that was commencing in the mining industry, so new field projects, new mining sites, that meant that in conjunction with your EA applications, you would be submitting a new PRCP, and that is what happens going forward for all new mine sites. Between 2019 and 2022, the 3-year period was a period of transition, where if you already held an EA agreement, then there would be a requirement to then fulfill some of those requirements in the legislation under a new PRCP. So if some areas had already been agreed out in your EA, those were now, I guess, respected and then held to, opposed to then saying, actually, we also need to include some of these PRCP processes in there as well. So currently sitting on the timeline, which is ending quite shortly, so 1st of November 2022, we've got a year to go for all mines to transition to PRCP planning stage. This is a big commitment that the government obviously is tied to, and we'll see how the industry actually plays out in this space. So this next session just talks about some of the frameworks that was used to drive the Act and policy reform. So one of those areas that we were just talking about was the Queensland Financial Insurance Framework. So in this framework, the FA framework, companies that undertake any resource activities to mitigate financial risk the state will endure if required to rehabilitate land. So this means that if you're in the mining industry and you're rehabilitating, you need to have a financial assurance to be able to pay for that. Makes sense. Unfortunately, in the old framework, this risk was estimated in 2017 to be about $7.3 billion over a 5-year period. And having a look at the financial assurance which had been committed to under most of the environmental agreements at the time, this number was nowhere near that, which meant that government is going to be out of pocket or would have been out of pocket for that sum of money. I guess one of the big key disadvantages of the old system, not only being out of pocket, was that this shortfall existed. So an example that the government website also shows is that the financial assurance from one of the companies stated that they were about $3.6 million required to rehabilitate. This company then went insolvent, and the upper estimate of the rehabilitation was actually around $80 million. So those differences are extreme. And this was one of those big levers that was being pulled by the government to say, hey, we need to have a look at this. We need to change the way in which we're operating. And we need to reduce the risk that is held by government in these bonds. So some of those areas that was, I guess, the reason why that huge shortfall existed was that discounts were implemented. And a number of ways that discounts were implemented were based on specific criteria. And if mine sites met those criteria, the government would happily give those discounts. Unfortunately, the way that those discounts worked was based off underestimation of rehabilitation costs, so the use of potentially the wrong calculation tools, and also the wrong concept of using contractors. So those were the two big things that sort of stood out and said, hey, you know, quotes being made by contractors were made due just to get the contract, opposed to actually what the cost was. So discounts reduced the surety held by the government by about $1.2 billion, which is a significant amount for the state. I guess we also talked about the underestimation of liability due to the incorrect tools. And one of those things, I guess, that the focus with that was where are you going to get that money if you couldn't actually pay for that rehabilitation? So this is now brought into focus the idea that miner operators are now going to have to go and find that money for themselves, opposed to then asking the government to cover them for it. Unfortunately, we all know what's actually happening in the world right now, and there's a huge green push or an environmental push to a lot of financial institutions to move away from mining companies. So banks are actually losing the appetite to provide financial assurance. We've got issues with indemnity insurance as well. And the upfront rehabilitation bonds, which used to flow quite freely from mining companies, now are starting to dry up. And we can know this from some of the big traders out there. So the National Bank of Australia, so NAB, who used to finance thermal coal up until 2023, has decided that it will, from that point, take on no rehabilitation costs for new customers in that thermal coal industry. So it will respect the current agreements to 2035, but from that point on, thermal coal industry, oil tar sands, and coal-fired power station generation will no longer be sponsored by NAB. This is one of many financial institutions out there which are now moving away from actually, I guess, financing and insuring the mining industry. So the other document that was, I guess, around that time was the Better Mine Rehabilitation for Queensland documents. This was introduced to, I guess, increase the reliability and the effectivity of rehabilitation on mine sites. So for one thing that it did, it introduced a life of mine plans for specific mines, a regulated monitoring, assessment and reporting. So that's something that was put into focus. Enforceable requirements for progressive rehabilitation was then resulted, and clear completion and sign-off requirements. So these were all implemented. And I guess one of the big things that came out of this was the requirement for life of mine planning, which I guess was introduced previously in previous documents that were around that 5-year mine plan with no milestones and no progressive rehabilitation targets set by the Environmental Authority. So these two areas were big concerns. So it's the finance and then also the idea that we plan, but we're not actually planning and signing the bottom line to say that we will do some of the rehabilitation that we promised to do. So this then resulted, as we just previously discussed, in the policy that was created. So the Mineland Rehabilitation Policy. So this meant that the progressive rehabilitation was introduced, and in order to reduce environmental impacts and reduce the cumulative areas of land that's been disturbed on a mine site. As we know, if you ever go through Queensland, driving past any of the mine sites out there, you do see a lot of disturbed land which hasn't been rehabilitated and often been put into care and maintenance. This was one of these, this is the reason why this paper has been drawn to, I guess, put the pressure back on mining companies to make sure that progressive rehabilitation happens. The main purpose of PRCP is to ensure that the holder of the environmental authority plans how and when activities will be carried out to maximise progressive rehabilitation. It also provides conditions which the holder must adhere to before rehabilitation is surrendered. So previously, rehabilitation may well have happened, but it may not well have been done to a standard that was acceptable for surrender. However, under the previous EA or understanding of those, I guess, previous agreements, sign-off happened, but potentially further down the line, there was still no responsibility. No one was held in perpetuity. To provide a certainty of rehabilitation outcomes and timing, there are two main elements to this. It's just the rehabilitation and planning, and there's the PRCP schedule, which is the statutory part. So understanding potentially there are mining engineers in this room who have an understanding about what scheduling is. A lot of the information that comes out from your mine plan schedules now drives the statutory requirement in PRCP. However, because it is a statutory requirement and I guess a simplified document than what you would normally have in a mine planning document, it is much simplified. However, the details and the planning behind it then sits inside of that rehabilitation planning stage. So the rehabilitation planning stage drives what is then put into your schedule and then what you're legally held for. So the next section is talking about the assessment process for PRCPs. So under this, we have application, public interest evaluation, information, notification, and decision. This section is directly for new EAs and new PRCP applications. So this is not to do with the transition period for companies who already hold existing EAs. Under that, as we discussed previously, there are a number of things that no longer apply because there's already been agreement made under those existing EAs. However, some things do still apply and still are required. One of the big things, though, is that public interest evaluation, which we'll talk about in a second. This is actually something that has changed in the last 2 years. So from the implementation of PRCP at the beginning of, at the end of 2019, since then, the requirement to actually have consultation with your local communities to tell them what's actually going to happen as your final land use has been a requirement in addition to what originally the government set out, which in my opinion ticks some of those boxes required for social responsibility and governance of areas in mining. So for this application process, the PRCP must be included in the assessment. So when you're putting forward a request for an environmental application, authority application, you need to include a PRCP. It's a statutory requirement now that the two documents go hand in hand. Existing sites, like I said, have the transition period, which might have altered stages and timeframes. So under the transition period, from the moment that you're given a notification for the requirement to move into PRCP, you have 6 months to comply with that. In the application stage, the authority receives the application, and within 10 days, the authority must determine if the application is properly made under the Act. So this is just a formal agreement to say, like, we've received your application, and in 10 days to say, yes, thank you, you've received it. Legislation states, though, that it must be submitted on the approved forms. So some of the lessons that we'll talk about later is that people are submitting some of this information on the wrong forms, in the wrong data sets, in the wrong format, which ultimately, when we're talking about large bodies of information, it is one of those important things that you need to conform to. The application requires an EAS process to be completed. If the PRCP was included, then it will then be reviewed as part of the EIS, so environmental impact statement process, and must accompany the EA application. If a PRCP was not required or not submitted, the applicant must prepare a PRCP along with the EA application. If the application has not met the requirements, the applicant has 20 business days to carry out the actions required. So the government is giving some leeway there, but it's also giving you some really tight timeframes to get a turnaround. So it's really important to make sure that the application is done correctly. Information stage. This is when the government gives some feedback, or the authority gives feedback onto what is actually going to be needed into that submission. This stage is applicable for both current holders of an EA as well as new required holders of EAs. And if under this information stage, the authority requires you to submit an EIS, then you have 6 months to do this, but no greater than 2 years. In the public evaluation stage, so this is one of the things that has changed since the start of PRCP process. It recommends that the approval of non-use mine areas, so NUMAs, must be determined in the best public interest. So there's a definition between 2 areas of land, one which will be rehabilitated and one which cannot be rehabilitated. The non-use mining areas are the ones that cannot be rehabilitated, and there needs to be some significant justification behind that. So, for example, one is that you cannot rehabilitate to a stable condition. A lot of people talk about mine voids as being one of those areas. However, you do need to prove that you can't just blast a high wall to get it back to its stable condition. You actually need to prove that what you're actually doing out there is not causing additional harm to the environment. So at that point, I think previously, really no one had talked to the local communities or people of public interest, such as local governments, about what was going to happen to mine sites at the end of the mine use. This section under the requirements now means that there needs to be a consultation plan, and there needs to be a consultation register to show what you're actually doing with the community to make sure that they're engaged. This is a significant change and something that in the next couple of years is really going to become part of focus and a requirement for industry to bring, I guess, their best game to the table, to show that they are able to rehabilitate the majority of the land and leave minimal amounts of NUMAs. It's a very complex area, and I guess DERM, or the Department of Environment and Science, recommend that if you do have a complex mine site where it is, the potential for multiple areas that you wouldn't be able to rehabilitate, or there will be a delay in rehabilitation, it is important that you then have that conversation with the authority, but then also to start making sure you're reaching out to those communities. The notification process, the legislation requires that after the application stage ends, this is the process where the PRCP is applied for. So the applicant must notify the public through public notice in newspapers and in any way it's possible, so that these things can be recorded to say that you have notified the community. This is slightly different from, I guess, the way that it was done in the past, where a lot of planning would have just happened inside of mining companies without that consultation. And I think we as an industry, this is an area that needs to be improved on, and something that will be a big focus coming into the future. I think we really do need to bring our chair to the table and actually have an open discussion about how the mining industry will work with communities going forward. In the decision stage, there are a few steps that are involved. So the approval of the process for the plan is with or without conditions. So once submitting the plan, plus also the statutory requirement schedule, the authority might determine that there are certain conditions that might apply to it. Or the other alternative is that there will be a refusal for that process. The The authority is satisfied if the schedule provides for all land that is either in a rehabilitated stable condition, and when we're talking about stable condition, it means that it's then able to be returned to its final land use without any ongoing issues, or requirement for monitoring will be required, but requirement for further maintenance, or that an NUMA is managed in a way that achieves best practice for that area. So we're talking about final voids and understanding about maybe the geochemical or the reactions that occur in the groundwater to make sure that there is minimal risks to the environment. So those are the two conditions that are sort of stated for the decision stage, making sure that your rehabilitation can actually happen and that it will be stable condition, and that any NUMAs are then left in a way which are manageable and of best practice at that time of submission. Of course, due to technology changes, those things may well be revised in the future. Now let's get into the elements that go into the PRCP. So the first part is, of the two elements, is rehabilitation planning. So the purpose of this section is to provide general information about the site and operation, information about the community consultation, as we've discussed, the analysis and justification of post-mining land uses, so those are the areas that can be rehabilitated, and the non-use management areas, which are the ones that can't be. Justification for timeframes or land being available for rehabilitation, and the available for improvement. So lands that can be available for rehabilitation are your PMLUs, and the ones that are for improvement are the NUMAs. And details about methodologies used and techniques used. So the plan development is not simple and is really detailed, and design is required. And this is when we start talking about it now becoming a multidisciplinary field. So it's no longer just the environmental team on mine sites looking at this and saying, oh yeah, we're going to be able to rehabilitate this section here, here, and here, and then we'll be able to do a closure plan at the end. This now is talking about involving your mine planning team, making sure that you have an understanding about the direction of mining, if there will be further mine changes, or where are those risks sitting in the mine plan, so that you can expect some of the outcomes. So the big points is that you need to be able to identify when land becomes available for rehabilitation. So you can no longer have back of dumps just sitting there looking out onto, the Peak Downs Highway. Those areas are now identified as areas which will no longer, mining will no longer be existing in that area. The mine is continuously progressing in a different direction. This area is now available for rehabilitation, and there needs to be a commitment to actually doing that rehabilitation. So this is, quite a tricky area, and I think it's interesting to see how many people have been, successful in this area with their applications, and how many people are potentially guesstimating and requiring in the future amendments to their application. Of course, we'll talk about amendments in a second, but DES says that they're happy to discuss site-specific queries or concerns when detailed designs are not possible in early stage mining. So it's not sometimes possible, and as potentially mine planners in this room or online can tell, that you can't always guarantee the direction of mining or that something will happen in the mine plan, because there is a certain amount of ambiguity or unknowns. Where this happens, the department or the authority requires concept designs and adequate material required to fulfill those concept designs as a bit of a focus. So it shouldn't deter you from producing a PRCP, it shouldn't deter you from including some information, but there just needs to be a note made that once decisions have been made that have changed in the planning process, a new submission or a resubmission of your PRCP is required. There are also legislation requirements associated with this section. So I guess the following tables over the next couple of slides tell us a little bit about what is required in this document that is produced. So part of that, I guess, if anyone's been involved in the environmental impact statements or any other environmental applications previously, you'll know that some of this information is extensive. There is a lot of planning, there's a lot of information that is required, and that's also part and parcel because it does support that statutory requirement under the schedule section. So project planning includes baseline information, project description, design for closure, rehabilitation improvement plans, and spatial information. So the baseline information is considered necessary by the authority. So this is things that you would generically have pretty much from the start of your mine site, and something that we would include in a lot of normal documentation, and not something that you would seem slightly unusual. So it's not in addition to what you would normally have into your environmental documents. Project description, again, is something that includes information about all mining tenures within the EA, including exploration permits, mineral development licenses, and mine claims. It's not simply just the area that you're currently mining or is in the mine plan, but it is the potential for what else is going to happen on that site. As we know, depending on commodity prices, mines have extended or contracted depending on, I guess, where either technology or those prices. So one of the main purposes of PRCP is to plan for how and where environmental relevant activities will be carried out on the land in a way that maximises the progressive rehabilitation of the land, so that it becomes a stable condition. This can be done through that design for closure process, and it ensures you have a good understanding about closure costs upfront when you start a mine or once you complete a design for closure. So I think a lot of the information that sits in this area really is generic to the mining industry that we would have it, but it's also about spelling out what is specifically happening on your site. So the progressive rehabilitation must also be maximised by commencing and completing rehabilitation as soon as practically after the land becomes available. So as discussed, in your mine plan, you need to be showing where the mine is moving and which areas then can be rehabilitated, so that you can then get as much out of it as possible as soon as possible. One of the areas, I guess, that has been great in the past, which has now been clarified through PRCP, it shows that in an area where the mine site is progressing, if mining is no longer going in that area for 10 years, you need to then show that it's going to be rehabilitated. So it is one of those areas that has been a little bit grey in the past, but now is as a requirement. So the two criteria of land usage is the post-mining land use, so the PMLU criteria, and then there's the non-use management areas, the NUMA criteria. So in terms of what's actually happening on the mine sites, selecting and justifying appropriate PMLUs is a fundamental part of the PRCP process, and it needs to consider surrounding landscapes, community views, the objectives of any local and regional planning strategies. So we're not just talking about, what you think would look great as a rehabilitation plan. We're also now taking into consideration what happens around in the local area and what happens in those local communities. So examples of PMLUs include native ecosystems, habitat, ecosystem services, grazing, agriculture, forestry, cropping, landfill, and water storage. And that's not just the only ones. And we know that in some of the areas overseas, you can also see ski slopes being created from mine sites, and also, energy producing sources, which is hydro energy. A description of the PLMUs must also include a description of the land use, specific vegetation or land suitability classification, identification of any permanent or essential management infrastructure which will be included. So that could include things such as roads. So ultimately, you may be handing the mine back into farming or grazing land, and through consultation with community, roads would be required on that land. Therefore, leaving roads is fine and not a requirement under the PRCP to rehabilitate. And completion criteria for measuring whether the PMLU has been successfully achieved. So if you're returning it to a native ecosystem, what are the things that are going to be key indicators of how you've actually achieved that? What fauna and flora will be there in the end, and how will you continue monitoring that up until surrender to the next holder? So NUMAs, as we discussed, are areas that cannot be rehabilitated to a stable condition after all relevant mining activities or activities in the area have ended. And so I did discuss this, but final voids being left in a metalliferous mine potentially cause damage to mine water, so groundwater sources. However, some of these, I guess, issues is that if you decided to rehabilitate that, or if you tried to bring it back to, I guess, the current native land use, the costs involved and the footprint that would be created by trying to rehabilitate a void back to, say, a natural profile of contoured land in the area would mean you'd actually be disturbing more land and having a higher environmental or more negative environmental impact on that area. So the NUMA footprint should be as small as practicable and limited environmental risk and future liability. So if there is a chance that some runoff is going to happen off your tenure, it has to be minimised. There can't just be an expectation that water runoff is going to happen and that it's not going to be controlled through sedimentary traps, through the idea that there's a system put in place so that the limited environmental impacts happen. So in the planning stage, the consideration of voids in floodplains also needs to occur. Obviously here in Queensland, we have had historic times when flooding has caused major issues in the mining industry and the resources industry. And so the idea that voids that exist inside those floodplains also create a potential hazard or a negative impact on the environment. So it is important that you identify all these areas and that you also do some significant modelling of floodplains through that area. So the Queensland Government will not approve a PRCP schedule that includes a void that is situated wholly or partially in a floodplain unless the void will be rehabilitated to a stable condition. So that's something that is a significant change, and I guess an understanding around that needs to be had straight away when you're actually planning the mines or planning the direction of mining. So obviously, if your final land mine use would be away from a floodplain, that's the best answer to this. So obviously, floodplain modelling is required for all sites and for void proposed in the NUMAs. So the PRCP must contain floodplain model report developed and by an appropriately qualified person. So it can't just be that an assumption is that you've done a contour map to say this is where your 1 in 100-year plan sits, and that's significant and sufficient enough to sign off. No, a qualified person has to do this. So community consultation is also something that we have sort of addressed previously, but we'll talk about it a little bit more in detail here. So under this requirement, you need to have a plan and a register. So people that you should be talking to are affected landholders, traditional owners, local government, local community groups, and any other groups that potentially are impacted by the mining of the resource. In that, the community consultation register must be kept, and that's to do with all communication that's happened with the community, where any information or details brought up to the community, an action plan has been a response out of that. So it just means that the community has an understanding about the direction of mining and what that final land use is actually going to be at the end of closure. Details that needs to be recorded, as you can see, of issues raised, how they've been considered, any actions coming out of it. And ongoing consultation should continue throughout the stages of a mine life. So, and this is something that I guess has not been done well in the past and not been done extensively enough, that as mine planners, or some of you in the room and online, we understand that potentially your mine plan changes on an annual basis depending on new geological information that's come about. At no point in the past has there been that much consultation with the local community to say, actually, things are changing. We're not going to have a pit void over here anymore. We're not going to do that creek diversion. We're actually going to stop the mine at this point here. That's something that's going to have to change. And as far as how this is going to be regulated in the future, this is going to be a really interesting point of how it develops. And I think the government will be finding that this is one of those areas of grey, where how much involvement can the community have in the mine planning process, and is it appropriate to have that, and is this now creating, I guess, an understanding that mining costs are actually greater than what we've predicted, because we have to take into consideration those community impacts. when we then look at the rehabilitation and management methodologies, we can see that once it's taken into consideration what the community needs is, what's the mine planning requirements, all these areas need to be then discussed in terms of rehabilitation. So general areas of rehabilitation practices, tailing storage facilities, voids, underground mining, and built infrastructure all need to be considered. So this section should be supported by a number of reports and studies that then support the PRCP planning stage. So the legislative requirements for this proposes that methods and techniques for rehabilitation of the land to a stable condition in a way that it supports rehabilitation milestones under the schedule, achieve best practice management for those NUMAs, and also then the best rehabilitation outcomes for PMLUs. So when we talk about the tailing storage facilities, they're one of those areas which contain some of the most hazardous materials on a mine site and represent significant long-term risks to the environment if not rehabilitated correctly. It also one of those areas also which is rehabilitated last because the processing of minerals occurs all the way up until the end of mine life. And so it really is one of those areas to get a good understanding of how that rehabilitation process will happen. And proposed tailing management options must minimise the interactions between tailings and the surrounding environment so that we're not releasing additional contaminants into the water sources particularly. This is a big area of, I guess, concern based off the fact that we haven't had many rehabilitated tailings facilities in Australia. And as mine sites get older and as we now are then forced into rehabilitation, this will be an area of much discussion, not just here in Australia, but globally. Void plans should be including information on the void filling, partial filling, reshaping, and void configuration through earthworks, such as backfilling, regrading, buttressing, and benching. It's not simply okay these days to say that it's fine to leave a final void. There has to be a study to state that this is the best management achieved in the area, and these are the ways that we're going to be able to either rehabilitate it or prove that you are causing more negative impact to the environment, therefore cannot rehabilitate the area. Underground mining, I guess, is a focus as well that we shouldn't forget about because we are in our mindset thinking about most open cut because that's the biggest, I guess, footprints that are caused here in Australia and in Queensland. So underground mine rehabilitation and management must include the construction and decommissioning phase of rehabilitation and confirm that underground workings and surface impacts have been decommissioned or remediated as planned. There is a lot of work then that has to be done in terms of the sealing of underground workings, sealing of surface ponding, and also cracking. So part of the built infrastructure, I guess we're talking about things like your workshops and areas where spillage or accumulation of hazardous substances occur. So that contamination of soil, the management of residual contamination, and the potential rehabilitation all need to be included in the plan. In addition to this information, we also require a risk assessment and also monitoring and maintenance of the area. So with a risk assessment, the stable condition of the land is described as in PMLUs is achieved, and it needs to be then determined whether or not there are greater risks out there to not achieving it. The risk assessment also must identify the risks of NUMAs causing environmental harm, so identifying that you cannot rehabilitate this, and then if there is an existing NUMA, how much harm and what would be put in place or what controls are put in place to reduce that harm, so that it is structurally stable, and the monitoring process then occurs afterwards and how it can be monitored. So one of the big things, I guess, that new mine sites and also existing mine sites go through at the moment is rehabilitation trials. You know, how much topsoil is required, what type of grass seed is required, is there a capping material of inert if you have acidic mine drainage? All those things need to be considered. However, under this current process, rehabilitation trials are not considered rehabilitation. They're simply a trial, and they should be used as a gap filling exercise where knowledge then is used to implement the best rehabilitation processing on that mine site. It at no stage should be a reason why you should delay rehabilitation. So under this PRCP requirement, you may well be doing rehabilitation trials, but it's not acceptable to say that you cannot start rehabilitation process in the new PRCP, which is, I guess, a slight change there, and maybe something that people have used in the past to get out of having to commit to or continue rehabilitation. Monitoring programs need to be significant, and they need to ensure that all milestones then are achieved inside the schedule. So I guess some of those things that need to also be identified is not just the monitoring and understanding of what's happening during that mine planning process and during the mining activities and rehabilitation creation. It's also about that post-closure monitoring, ensuring milestones for surrender are being met as per the schedule. So this information is extensive. It is a lot that you have to take in and a lot that you have to consider, and it is all information that underpins some of those key milestones that then are included in the schedule. It shouldn't be taken lightly that this information, some of it just doesn't exist currently on mine sites, and that it does take time to consider and also to collect. It does pose a question out there that potentially some of the PRCPs that have been submitted may not include all of this information or a substantial amount of information as it would be required, just because the sheer amount of data that's required to collect this is huge. And in a 3-year period, once you've been given a notification to adhere to this, you know, it's going to be quite hard for a lot of companies that currently act under an EA to achieve some of these requirements. So in the next year, it'll be interesting to see what happens in this PRCP place. The next section is the schedule, so the statutory requirement under PRCP. So submission obviously includes both the plan and also the schedule, but it's the schedule that is the legally binding document. So the PRCP schedule consists of the following. So the identification of PMLUs and NUMAs, when land becomes available for rehabilitation or when it's available for improvement, rehabilitation and management milestones to achieve those areas, milestone criteria and completion dates, and any considerations necessary to or desired imposed by the authority. Once approved by the authority, the PRCP schedule becomes a legally binding and enforceable instrument which the holder must comply. So the Department of Environment and Science just there are 7 steps to producing a PRCP schedule. They include final pit design, divide the area into PMLU and NUMAs, determine when the land becomes available, to develop relevant milestones, develop site-specific milestone criteria, propose when first milestones must commence, and propose timing for when each milestone will be completed. Seems simple. However, we've just talked about the sheer amount of information that goes into driving each of these areas. So when we talk about the final mine site design, it's actually a map that's required by the authority. And it's a map showing the community, so that's our main user at the end of it, what the site would look like under post-surrender. So it needs to show the maximum disturbance footprint, the resource tenure boundaries, PMLUs, NUMAs for the land and the resource tenure, and floodplain extent. So those are the 4 things that really are important to include. When dividing the areas into rehabilitation improvement areas, the purpose of this is to break down the site into the areas to allow for progressive rehabilitation. So that's in the name in itself. It says once it's broken down, only areas of disturbance need to be included in the rehabilitation areas and improvement areas. So if you're not mining in that area, we don't need to be thinking about it. So when the land becomes available, again, we've talked about this, but it is an important thing to say that an area is considerable available if the land is not being mined and will be required to be rehabilitated unless it is used for infrastructure, unless the area contains probable or proven ore reserves that will be mined within 10 years. So that's a big thing that needs to be considered. I know from previous work on mine sites, sometimes areas are put on hold because there's either not an appetite to go in there because they're challenging areas to get into, because potentially there's water or mud in the pit. If your mine plan just shows that you are not going in there for 10 years, you need to show that you are rehabilitating it. This is a significant change to legislation. So developing relevant milestones, the rehabilitation milestones need to identify significant events or steps required to rehabilitate that to a stable condition. So under the schedule, those areas are identified and broken down into certain milestones. For example, decommissioning of infrastructure, the creation of profiling of dumps, the use of inert or topping materials, topsoil placement, revegetation. These are all steps that need to be included for each area that's been identified. So there could be a mining area, there could be an infrastructure area, there could be existing rehabilitation that hasn't actually been signed off yet. So what further things need to be done in that area? These parameters, I guess, are site specific, and they need to facilitate the subsequent milestone that happens afterwards. So there needs to be a flow of progress. You can't just start topsoiling when you haven't profiled. There needs to be a consecutive understanding about what happens next in the process. The next one is proposed when the first milestones must be commenced. So rehabilitation or management milestones must start as soon as practicable and after the land area has become available for rehabilitation or management. Amendments in this area is going to be one of the biggest challenges in the future, and one of those things that's just going to happen consistently. I'm yet to have an understanding about how the government or the authority will be dealing with the number of amendments coming through, based off the fact that mine plans change annually, if not 6 monthly. This, however, may put a little bit of pressure back on mine plans to be a little bit more static and not quite as dynamic as they have been in the past. However, it is an area which I just see as being one of those areas that's going to hold up due to the bureaucracy or paperwork that's required in putting forward amendments, and then the time that is required for the government body to assess whether those amendments are justified. However, it is possible to make an amendment, and it is exactly the same process if you were making an amendment to your EA. So step 7 was the proposed time for when the milestones will be completed. So completion dates are based off the calendar year, which start and end on the 10th of December. So for example, if you believe your rehabilitation area will be completed on the 30th of September, in the schedule, you'll be telling that it actually is on the 10th of December. So if it happens in that calendar year, you use the last date. This allows for consistent reporting across all mine sites from an authority perspective. Guys, it looks as though we might run over time based on the information being provided. What I will do is, if you have any questions throughout this session, please put it in the chat box, and I will try and get back to you within the next week with some answers. So this is a template of the schedule that is provided by the government, and here is a worked example of what actually happens. So in this map, you can see that Area 1 in this polygon here has an approximate area of 65 hectares. That hectare availability is broken down over the years to say that on a cumulative event by 2042, there'll be 65 hectares of land which is available for rehabilitation. The milestones down the bottom here, I'll just move my picture so that you can see. Milestones on this example have been given as milestones 1 through 9 for this specific area. Milestones 4, 6 and 8 were not required. However, you can see that in that first year, of the 10 hectares that was available for rehabilitation, 10 hectares have had infrastructure and decommissioning removed. Of that 10 hectares, 8 hectares has had land development and reshaping and reprofiling, and 3 hectares has had surface preparation. You can see this cumulative area and milestones achieved finalised in 2060 for achieving post-mining land use, so that's stable condition. So the maximum penalty for non-compliance with this schedule is, for environmental activities, unless there is a PRCP schedule for that activity, is 4,500 penalty units, which approximately works out to be about $620,000. And if a condition is willfully contravened, the maximum penalty is 6,250, or units, or 5 years in prison. That works out to be about $860,000. So it is a significant risk if you decide to operate outside of your requirements under your PRCP, or operating in areas which are not covered by those maps or by your schedule, which it, I guess, puts a little bit of focus in the future on how the government will be monitoring this and how it will be ensuring that people are then aware of some of those issues. I know there has been a discussion about using Google Earth as a potential use, but we know that those photos aren't dated quite often, so there will have to be another cost-friendly alternative for the government to consider. I guess some of the issues that we have, I guess, dealt with from a mine planning perspective, it really is all about focusing on closure of life of the mine plan and planning for that closure, so that you can progressively understand how rehabilitation goes to that closure perspective. Early identification of material for fill purposes is also one of those things that needs to be identified. So selective mining is one of those things that we need to be focusing a little bit more on, because there will be a requirement for you to move topsoil or inert material back to these rehabilitation areas. If it is not planned for in the mine planning space, we will see huge costs in terms of rehandle or the need to actually bring in materials which are insufficient on current mine sites. Lessons learned by industry currently. These are things that the Department of Environmental Science has also recommended, that engagement between the department and the authority is important. Information that is site-specific or I guess in an area where there is complex mine designs, discussions with communities, these are all big areas that the authority and that Des recommends you discuss prior to creating your PRCP. And there's also applications requirements are met. So, the description of the rehabilitation area that potentially also exists that you might not be including in that plan, it does need to. It needs to be provided in a shape file, and also there needs to be an understanding that if you are not including certain aspects in your application, you need to state why you're not including those aspects. And then the other lessons learned is that the application requirements are met for spatial data validation, community consultation, rehabilitation milestones, and I guess the idea that you are then being bound specifically to that statutory requirement under the schedule. So having a deep understanding of your mine plan, all the additional processes that are involved on your mine, such as geology, geotechnical assessments, and environmental assessments, all these go into then your PRCP. These are the documents that we have used in this presentation and will be available to you at the end of this presentation. thank you for the time today. I apologise, this last couple of slides were rushed. We will provide this information to you after the event, but realistically, this is a really good overview of PRCP. It is an area that we will be focusing on a lot in the next couple of years, particularly once that transition phase has finished. And it'll be interesting to see on a number of areas of how this area will be improved, particularly around that consultation with community, but also about those changes that will happen in the mine plan and amendments that will need to be required for PRCPs. So thank you very much for everyone joining online as well. It's been a pleasure presenting to you. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or email me directly. Thank you.